The shuttle docked with a soft hiss, and Mika Chen stepped into the most beautiful place she had ever seen. Centauri Academy floated in the darkness between stars, its crystal spires catching light from distant suns. Through the massive windows, she could see the swirling colors of 3 different nebulae painting the void in shades of purple and gold. "Welcome to Centauri Academy," said the guide, a tall being made of what looked like living crystal. Its voice came from somewhere inside its translucent body. "I am Instructor Kithara of the Vorthak. You must be our new exchange student from Terra." Mika nodded, trying not to stare. She had seen pictures of aliens before, but being face-to-face with one was different. The Vorthak's body reflected the station's lights like a prism, creating dancing rainbows on the walls. "Thank you for having me," Mika said. "This place is amazing." Kithara's crystalline form shimmered in what she had learned was their version of a smile. "We are excited to have our first Terran student. Your species has just joined the Galactic Council. There is much curiosity about your people." They walked through corridors filled with beings that seemed impossible. A group of what looked like floating jellyfish drifted past, speaking in musical tones that made the air itself vibrate. Near them, creatures that appeared to be made of silver liquid discussed something in rapid clicking sounds. "The Nebulites and the Mercurials," Kithara explained, noticing her interest. "They are studying together for tomorrow's chemistry exam. Very different species, but they share a love of molecular science." Mika watched as one of the jellyfish-like beings extended a tendril to touch the liquid creature. Where they connected, both beings glowed softly. It was beautiful and strange. "How many species attend the academy?" she asked. "Currently, we host students from 47 different worlds," Kithara said with obvious pride. "Centauri Academy has been a symbol of peaceful cooperation for over 3,000 years. Violence is unknown here. We have evolved beyond such primitive responses." The word primitive made Mika wince slightly, but she said nothing. She had been warned that many galactic species viewed humanity as backwards. Her home planet Earth was classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, meaning it was considered extremely dangerous to most forms of life. They passed through a garden dome, where plants from dozens of worlds grew together in impossible combinations. Trees that looked like they were made of metal grew next to flowers that sang when the wind touched them. In the center, students sat in groups, their various forms creating a scene that looked like something from a dream. "Your dormitory assignment," Kithara said, handing her a tablet that felt warm to the touch. "You will be sharing quarters with Zira of the Pacifican Collective. She is very gentle and will help you adjust to our ways." Mika took the tablet and looked at the information. Her roommate appeared to be some kind of plant-based being, all flowing green curves and soft edges. She looked friendly enough. "What about classes?" Mika asked. "Ah, yes." Kithara's form brightened. "You have been enrolled in our standard program. Galactic history, xenobiology, diplomatic protocols, and theoretical sciences. However, I see here you requested some unusual electives." Mika felt her cheeks warm. "I'm interested in survival sciences and environmental adaptation. I know they're probably not popular subjects here." Kithara paused, its crystalline form flickering with what might have been confusion. "These are historical subjects. No species has needed such knowledge for millennia. Why would a young being wish to study such archaic topics?" "Just curious, I guess," Mika said, not wanting to explain that on Earth survival skills weren't archaic at all. They were necessary. They reached her dormitory, a comfortable room with 2 beds and a large window showing the starfield outside. Her roommate was already there, a graceful being whose skin looked like living bark and whose hair moved like kelp in an ocean current. "You must be Mika," Zira said, her voice like wind through leaves. "I am so pleased to meet you. I have never encountered a being from a Deathworld before." The way she said Deathworld made it sound exotic rather than dangerous, like being from an interesting tourist destination rather than a planet that actively tried to kill everything on it. Over the next few days, Mika settled into academy life. Her fellow students were endlessly curious about Earth, but their questions revealed how little they understood about her world. They asked about human art and philosophy, but seemed confused when she tried to explain concepts like predator and prey. "Your planet has creatures that hunt other creatures?" asked Jelen, a spherical being covered in soft fur. "How terrible! Why did your authorities not remove such dangerous animals?" Mika tried to explain that on Earth hunting was natural, that ecosystems depended on the balance between hunters and hunted. But Jelen just looked horrified. His species had eliminated all dangerous life from their world thousands of years ago. In her survival sciences class, she was the only student. Professor Undal, an elderly being that looked like a walking tree, seemed surprised that anyone had signed up. This course covers primitive survival techniques, he explained on the first day. Tool-making, shelter building, food procurement in hostile environments. I must admit, I created this curriculum as a historical exercise. I never expected anyone to actually take it. Mika raised her hand. Professor, would it be possible to include some practical exercises? Maybe some hands-on training? Professor Undal's branches rustled in what she was learning to recognize as alien laughter. My dear student, there are no hostile environments on the station. We have perfect climate control, abundant food supplies, and no dangerous creatures. What would be the point of practical survival training? Well, Mika said carefully, what if someone got stranded on an unexplored world? Or if ship systems failed during a long journey? The professor's leaves rustled again. Modern technology makes such scenarios essentially impossible. But I suppose we could discuss some theoretical applications. It was the same in all her classes. Her fellow students were brilliant and kind, but they lived in a universe where safety was guaranteed, where technology solved every problem, where the idea of physical danger was as foreign as breathing underwater. During lunch, she sat with a group of students from various species. They were discussing their weekend plans, which seemed to involve a lot of art appreciation and philosophical debate. What did you do for fun on your homeworld, Mika? Asked Vex, a being that looked like a collection of floating geometric shapes. Mika thought about hiking through forests where bears and wolves still roamed free, about camping trips where a wrong turn could mean getting lost for days, about learning to swim in oceans that contained sharks and jellyfish and creatures that could kill her in a dozen different ways. Oh, you know, she said finally, outdoor activities mostly, hiking, swimming, that sort of thing. How wonderful, exclaimed Zira. Controlled recreation environments are so relaxing. I love the virtual reality nature programs they have here. Mika nodded and smiled, not mentioning that her hiking involved real mountains with real cliffs and real weather that could change from sunny to deadly in minutes. Or that her swimming had been in actual oceans, not carefully maintained pools. As the days passed, she began to understand something that both fascinated and worried her. These beings, for all their intelligence and technology, had never faced real danger. They had never had to fight for their lives, never had to make split-second decisions that meant the difference between living and dying. They were peaceful, advanced, and incredibly civilized. They were also, by human standards, completely helpless. And as she watched them move through their perfect, safe world, Mika began to realize that she was something entirely new in their experience. She was a product of a world that had tried to kill her since birth, and she had not only survived but thrived. She was a predator among prey who had forgotten what predators were. 3 weeks into her time at Centauri Academy, Mika found herself in advanced diplomatic theory, arguably the most important class in the curriculum. The circular classroom was designed so students could see each other while discussing complex political situations. Today's topic was recent additions to the Galactic Council. Professor Meridian, a wise-looking being whose skin seemed to be made of shifting star patterns, gestured to the holographic display showing recent council votes. As we can see, the integration of new species into galactic society has always been a delicate process. Today we will examine the most recent addition, humanity. Mika felt every eye in the room turn to her. She tried to keep her expression neutral as the professor continued. The Terran species presents unique challenges, Professor Meridian said. They come from what we classify as an extreme Deathworld environment. Their rapid technological advancement and aggressive expansion have raised concerns among some council members. A student near the back raised what appeared to be a wing. Mika recognized him as Zephyr, an Altarian noble who seemed to think very highly of himself. His species looked somewhat like humans, but taller and more angular, with pale blue skin and silver hair. They had been part of the galactic community for thousands of years. Professor, Zephyr said in a voice that managed to sound both smooth and condescending, is it wise to allow such a primitive species into our council? The Altarian delegation has serious concerns about their instincts. Mika felt her jaw tighten but kept quiet. She had been warned about Altarian attitudes toward newer species. "That is an interesting perspective, Zephyr," Professor Meridian replied. "What specific concerns do you have?" Zephyr stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow across several other students. "Their entire culture is based on violence and competition. They still engage in wars on their own planet. They consume other living creatures for food. They even enjoy simulated combat as entertainment." His silver eyes fixed on Mika. "How can such beings possibly understand true civilization?" Mika took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was a learning environment. "If I may respond to that," she said calmly. Professor Meridian nodded. "Please, Mika. Your perspective would be valuable." Mika stood up, noting how several students instinctively leaned away from her. "Zephyr raises some valid points about human culture, but I think he misunderstands what those traits actually represent. Yes, humans have conflicts, but we also have something that might be even more important: the ability to overcome our differences and work together despite them." "Work together?" Zephyr laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. "Your species couldn't even achieve global unity before reaching the stars. You still have separate nations that compete with each other." "That's true," Mika agreed, "but consider what that means. Humans learn to cooperate despite having fundamental differences in culture, language, and beliefs. We didn't achieve peace by becoming identical. We achieved it by learning to value our differences." Several students looked thoughtful at this, but Zephyr's expression grew more disdainful. "How can you call constant struggle a strength?" he demanded. "Altarians achieved perfect social harmony 10,000 years ago. We eliminated war, poverty, and crime through superior evolution and organization. We don't need to overcome differences because we were intelligent enough to eliminate them entirely." Mika felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had read about Altarian society in her diplomatic studies. Their perfect harmony had been achieved by eliminating anyone who didn't fit their ideal mold. "With respect," she said, her voice still calm, "that's not really cooperation. That's just uniformity. When everyone thinks the same way, agreement isn't an achievement. It's just an echo chamber." Zephyr's pale skin flushed darker blue. "You dare insult Altarian civilization? A barbaric Deathworlder questioning the achievements of a culture older than your entire species?" "I'm not insulting anything," Mika replied evenly. "I'm just pointing out that there's a difference between peace through understanding and peace through elimination of opposition." "Enough." Zephyr's voice cracked like a whip through the classroom. "I will not be lectured by a primitive whose ancestors were still throwing rocks at their enemies, while mine were building interstellar empires." Professor Meridian started to intervene. "Zephyr, please remember our academic protocols." "No." Zephyr turned to face the class, his silver hair flowing dramatically. "This is exactly what I warned about. They cannot control their aggressive impulses. Look at her." Everyone did look at Mika. She stood perfectly still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady. To the untrained eye, she appeared completely calm. But Zephyr saw something else. Maybe it was some deeply buried instinct from his species' predatory past, or maybe it was just intuition. But he saw the way she held herself, the slight shift in her posture that spoke of readiness. "She's not even civilized enough to back down from a superior being," he declared. That was when he made his mistake. Altarian nobles carried ceremonial blades as symbols of their ancient heritage. They were ornamental pieces, works of art more than weapons, representing a culture that had moved beyond the need for violence. No one had drawn one in anger for generations. But Zephyr's pride was wounded, and somewhere in his genetically perfect mind, ancient circuits fired that hadn't been active for millennia. His hand moved to the curved blade at his side. The classroom went dead silent as he drew the weapon. It was beautiful, all flowing curves and mirror-bright metal designed more for ceremony than combat. He held it out toward Mika, not quite pointing it at her but making his meaning clear. "This," he said dramatically, "is what real civilization looks like. Art, beauty, tradition, not the crude tools of violence that your species worships." He expected her to step back, to show fear, to demonstrate the natural deference that any civilized being would show when faced with a weapon. He expected her to prove his point about human primitiveness by being either terrified or aggressive in response. Instead, something happened that he had not expected, that no one in the room had expected. that went against every assumption they had made about how intelligent beings behaved in the presence of danger. Mika smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a nervous smile. It wasn't the kind of smile that civilized beings use to diffuse tension or show submission. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that all her predictions had come true. The smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment without knowing it. It was the smile of a predator who had just watched prey reveal its position. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Students who had never felt fear in their entire lives suddenly found their hearts racing for reasons they couldn't understand. Ancient instincts that their species had edited out of their genomes began screaming warnings that their conscious minds couldn't interpret. Professor Meridian's star-patterned skin began to flicker rapidly, a sign of extreme distress in his species, and Zephyr, who had expected to cow a primitive barbarian into submission, found himself staring into the eyes of something that his deepest genetic memories recognized as the most dangerous thing in the universe, an apex predator that was no longer pretending to be harmless. "Oh," Mika said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the absolute silence. "You really shouldn't have done that." Her smile grew wider, and every being in the room suddenly understood that they were no longer in a classroom discussing theoretical, diplomatic scenarios. They were in a hunting ground, and they were not the hunters. Time seemed to stretch like melted glass. The classroom, which moments before had been filled with the comfortable chatter of academic debate, now held a silence so complete that Mika could hear the soft humming of the station's life support systems. She didn't move toward Zephyr. She didn't need to. Instead, she began to speak in the same calm, measured tone she might use to explain a homework assignment. "You know," she said conversationally, "this is actually a perfect teaching moment about the differences between our species." Zephyr's hand trembled slightly as he held the ceremonial blade. He had expected her to recoil, to show fear, to do something that made sense. Instead, she stood there like she was about to give a presentation. "On my world," Mika continued, taking a small step to her right, "we have a saying, never draw a weapon unless you intend to use it. But more importantly, never draw a weapon unless you're absolutely certain you can use it better than your opponent." Her movement seemed casual, but every eye in the room followed her. Something about the way she moved was different now, fluid, purposeful, like a cat that had suddenly noticed a mouse. "The thing is," she said, now moving in a slow circle around the edge of the classroom, "humans spent about 2 million years learning how to kill things. Not because we wanted to, but because everything else on our planet was trying to kill us first." Professor Meridian tried to speak. "Mika, perhaps we should—" "Oh, this is educational," Mika interrupted gently, never taking her eyes off Zephyr. "See, Zephyr just made a very common mistake. He assumed that because his species gave up violence, violence itself became less effective. But that's not how it works." She was now positioned so that she could see the entire room while keeping Zephyr in her peripheral vision. Violence didn't become obsolete because you evolved past it. You evolved past it because you made your environment safe enough that you didn't need it anymore. But the laws of physics didn't change. Zephyr tried to regain his composure. "You're proving my point," he said, his voice not quite steady. "Barbarian thinking. Primitive responses." Mika's smile never wavered. "Am I being barbarian? I haven't threatened anyone. I haven't raised my voice. I'm just talking." She paused, tilting her head slightly. "But you're scared anyway, aren't you?" The question hung in the air like a live wire. Zephyr's blue skin had gone pale and his breathing was shallow. "You see," Mika continued in the same teacher-like tone, "this is where the real education begins. Right now you're experiencing something your species hasn't felt in thousands of years. You're in the presence of a predator, and your body knows it even if your mind doesn't understand it." She gestured casually toward the blade in his hand. "That's a beautiful piece of art, by the way. The balance is all wrong for actual combat, though. Too heavy in the pommel, and the curve is designed for ceremonial aesthetics rather than cutting efficiency. If you actually tried to use it as a weapon, you'd probably hurt yourself more than your target." Zephyr's grip on the blade tightened. You can't what?" Mika asked pleasantly. "Analyze a tool?" "I've been doing that since I was old enough to hold a stick. See, on Earth, everything can be a tool or a weapon depending on how you use it. That tablet Vex is holding. The corner is sharp enough to target pressure points. Jellen's nutrient dispenser. The cap comes off and the tube could be used as a blowgun if you had the right projectiles. As she spoke, she continued her slow movement around the room. Every student she mentioned instinctively looked at the object she'd named, then at her, then at the object again with new and uncomfortable awareness. The chair supports are all hollow aluminum, she continued conversationally. Light but strong. Remove the padding and you have an excellent striking implement. The emergency oxygen masks have adjustable straps, perfect length for restraints or improvised ropes. Professor Meridian's star-patterned skin was now flickering so rapidly, it was almost strobing. Mika, this is not appropriate classroom discussion, but it's exactly what Zephyr asked for, Mika replied without looking away from the Altarian student. He wanted to understand the difference between primitive and civilized species. So let me explain it. She stopped moving and faced Zephyr directly. You think civilization means the absence of violence, but that's not what it means at all. Civilization means having the power to choose violence or peace, and choosing peace because it's better, not because it's the only option you have. The room was so quiet that when Zephyr swallowed nervously, everyone heard it. Right now, Mika said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. You're holding a weapon. You drew it to intimidate me, to show your superiority. But here's what you don't understand. From the moment you pulled that blade, this stopped being a debate and became a combat scenario. She took one step forward, just one, but somehow it seemed to close the distance between them by more than the physical space would suggest. And in a combat scenario, she continued, there are exactly 17 different ways I could disarm you using only things within arm's reach of where I'm standing right now. Zephyr's eyes darted around the room, trying to see what she was seeing. All he saw were desks, chairs, and school supplies. For example, Mika said in the tone of a helpful teacher, if I grabbed that writing stylus from Kithara's desk and applied pressure to the nerve cluster just below your wrist, your hand would open involuntarily and you'd drop the blade. Takes about 2 pounds of force in less than half a second. Zephyr looked at the innocuous writing tool as if it had suddenly grown fangs. Or, Mika continued cheerfully, I could use the edge of Professor Meridian's podium to create leverage against your elbow joint. Your arm would hyperextend, you'd lose grip strength, and again, blade drops. Physics is wonderful that way. She clasped her hands behind her back, the picture of a patient educator. The really interesting option would be to use the emergency gravity plate under Vex's desk. If I activated it while you were off balance, you'd fall forward, and I could simply step aside and let momentum do the work. You'd probably bruise your knees, but the blade would skitter across the floor, and this would all be over. Every single method she described was delivered in the same calm, almost bored tone that a professor might use to explain basic mathematics, but with each word Zephyr seemed to shrink a little more. The point is, Mika concluded, you're not holding a weapon. You're holding a liability, because you don't know how to use it, and I know exactly how to take it away from you. The only reason I haven't done it already is because I'm choosing not to. She smiled again, and this time there was something almost kind in it.
That's what civilization actually looks like, Zephyr.
Not the absence of power, but the choice not to use it. The ceremonial blade fell from Zephyr's nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor, and in that moment, every being in the room understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented in the Academy's 3,000-year history. They had seen what it looked like when a predator chose to be merciful. The blade hit the floor with a sound like a bell being struck. In the silence that followed, Mika looked down at the fallen weapon, then back up at Zephyr with something that might have been disappointment. Well, she said softly. That was anticlimactic. Zephyr stood frozen, his silver hair disheveled and his pale blue skin now almost white. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths, and his eyes were wide with something his species hadn't experienced in millennia. Genuine fear. I was actually hoping for a more educational demonstration, Mika continued, crouching down to examine the fallen blade without touching it. This is really beautiful craftsmanship. See how the metal has been folded? That's an ancient technique. Your ancestors were clearly skilled metalworkers. She looked up at Zephyr from her crouched position. They were probably skilled fighters too, before your species evolved past the need for personal combat. There's nothing shameful about that, you know. Violence isn't inherently evil. It's just a tool like any other. Professor Meridian finally found his voice. Mika, I think perhaps we should end this lesson. Oh, but we're just getting to the good part, Mika said, rising gracefully to her feet. See, Zephyr raised some excellent points about human primitiveness. I think his classmates deserve a complete answer. She turned to address the room, but her positioning kept Zephyr in her sight at all times. How many of you have ever been in actual physical danger? The silence stretched on. Finally, Kithara's crystalline form flickered. I do not understand the question. Have you ever been in a situation where you might die if you made the wrong choice? Mika clarified. Where your survival depended on your own abilities rather than technology or help from others. More silence. The students looked at each other uncertainly. That's what I thought, Mika said, not unkindly. And that's fine. Your civilizations have advanced to the point where individual survival skills aren't necessary. But here's what you need to understand about humans. We never had that luxury. She began to move again, not toward anyone in particular, just a slow, measured pace around the room. But her movement served a purpose. It kept everyone slightly off balance, never quite certain where her attention was focused. Earth is what you call a Class 12 Deathworld, she continued. That means it actively tries to kill everything on it. The weather can change from safe to lethal in minutes. The plants are often poisonous. The animals see everything else as either food or competition. She paused next to Jellen's desk. Your homeworld eliminated dangerous predators thousands of years ago, right, Jellen? The fuzzy spherical being nodded nervously. Earth still has bears, Mika said conversationally. 6-foot-tall omnivores with claws like knives and enough strength to break trees. We share the planet with them. We go camping in their territory for fun. Jellen's fur stood on end. We also have sharks, she continued, moving to Vex's desk. Some of them are 20 feet long and can smell blood from miles away. Humans swim in oceans with sharks, on purpose. For recreation. Vex's geometric shapes began rotating more rapidly, a sign of distress in his species. The point isn't that we're brave, Mika explained. The point is that we learn to assess and manage risk as a basic survival skill. Every human child learns to read body language, to identify threats, to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. She was now standing near Zephyr again, but not close enough to seem threatening. Just close enough to remind him that she could be closer if she chose. When I walked into this classroom 3 weeks ago, she said, I automatically cataloged every exit, every potential weapon, every student's physical capabilities, and at least 12 different escape or defense scenarios. Not because I expected trouble, but because that's how human minds work. It's unconscious, instinctive. Zephyr swallowed hard. That's exactly what I meant about primitive thinking. Is it? Mika asked. Or is it just a different kind of intelligence? You see, Zephyr, when you drew that blade, you made a calculation. You assumed that the threat of violence would give you social dominance. You were using fear as a tool to win an argument. She smiled slightly. The problem is you're not very good at using fear as a tool. You don't understand it well enough. I don't. Zephyr started to protest. Let me show you, Mika interrupted gently. She took 3 steps toward him, not quickly, not aggressively, just a normal walking pace. But something in her posture changed. The casual academic demeanor dropped away like a discarded coat, revealing something underneath that was far older and more primal. Zephyr took an involuntary step backward. Fear, Mika said in a voice that somehow carried more weight than it should have, is information. It tells you when you're in the presence of something that could harm you. Right now, your body is screaming at you to run, to fight, or to submit. Do you know why? Zephyr couldn't speak. He could only stare as she took another step. Because I stopped pretending, she said simply. For 3 weeks, I've been acting like a harmless student, smiling, asking polite questions, fitting in. But that's not what I am. Another step. She was now close enough that he could smell her shampoo, something floral and completely at odds with the aura of danger radiating from her small human frame. I'm an apex predator pretending to be domesticated, she said softly. And right now I'm letting you see what I actually am. Zephyr's back hit the wall. He hadn't even realized he'd been retreating. This is what real fear feels like, Mika continued, her voice now barely above a whisper. Not the abstract concept you've read about in historical texts. This is the actual biochemical response your species evolved when something wanted to eat your ancestors. She was close enough now that she could have reached out and touched him. Instead, she just stood there, radiating a sense of controlled lethality that made the air itself feel dangerous. The beautiful thing about fear, she said, is that it's honest. Your mind might lie to you, your pride might deceive you, but fear tells you the truth about power dynamics. She leaned slightly closer, and Zephyr pressed himself against the wall as if he could somehow phase through it. And the truth is, Mika whispered, that in any physical confrontation between us you would lose. Not because you're weak, but because you've never had to be strong. Not because you're stupid, but because you've never had to be smart about violence. She paused, letting that sink in. Your species gave up the capacity for violence, thinking it made you superior. But what you actually did was make yourselves helpless. You traded strength for safety, and that's a fine trade, as long as you never meet anything that didn't make the same deal. She stepped back, and the oppressive aura of danger faded like a turned-off light switch. Suddenly, she was just a teenage girl again, looking slightly embarrassed by the whole situation. But here's the really important part, she said, her normal voice returning. I don't want to hurt you. None of us humans do. We're not looking for victims or conquest. We're just trying to find our place in the galaxy alongside everyone else. She bent down and picked up the fallen blade, handling it with casual expertise before setting it gently on Professor Meridian's desk. The question isn't whether humans are too primitive for galactic society, she said, addressing the room. The question is whether galactic society is ready for the kind of friends who would die to protect you and kill to save you, because that's what friendship means to us. She looked back at Zephyr, who was still pressed against the wall, and her expression was genuinely apologetic. I'm sorry I scared you, she said, but you needed to understand the difference between having power and being controlled by it. Humans aren't dangerous because we're violent. We're safe because we choose not to be. The news traveled faster than light. By the time Mika returned to her dormitory that evening, her personal communicator was buzzing with messages from across the galaxy. The classroom recording, standard procedure for all academic sessions, had somehow found its way onto the Galactic Information Network within hours. Her roommate Zira was waiting for her, her plant-like features showing an emotion that Mika had never seen before, awe mixed with something that might have been fear. Everyone is talking about you, Zira said, her voice rustling like leaves in a storm. They are calling you the Deathworld girl. The recording has been viewed 17 million times in the last 6 hours. Mika sank onto her bed, suddenly feeling very tired. I didn't mean for it to become a spectacle. I was just trying to make a point about the fact that we are all children playing at being adults, Zira interrupted gently, while you are an adult pretending to be a child. The truth of that statement hit Mika harder than she expected. She looked out the window at the beautiful, peaceful station floating in the void, and realized that she would never be able to see it the same way again. She had broken something fundamental, the illusion of universal safety that these beings had lived with their entire lives. Over the next few days, everything changed. Students who had barely noticed her before now watched her with a mixture of fascination and wariness. Professors spoke to her with a careful respect that hadn't been there before. Even the custodial staff, members of a species that looked like mobile mushrooms, gave her a wider berth in the corridors. But the most unexpected change came from Zephyr himself. 3 days after the incident, he appeared at her door looking haggard and somehow smaller than he had before. His perfect Altarian composure was gone, replaced by something more genuine and uncertain. May I speak with you? He asked formally. Mika gestured him in, noting how he unconsciously positioned himself near the door, ready to flee if necessary. The predator part of her mind filed this information away automatically. I have been thinking, he said without preamble, about what you said, about the difference between giving up violence and being unable to use it. Mika waited. She had learned that sometimes the best response was simply to listen. My people, Zephyr continued, staring at his hands, we are very proud of our advancement. We eliminated war, crime, even serious disagreement. We thought this made us superior to younger species. It's an impressive achievement, Mika said carefully. Is it? Zephyr looked up at her with eyes that seemed older than they had a week ago. Or did we just make ourselves irrelevant? When that blade was in my hand, I felt something I had never experienced before. Not just fear, purpose. For a moment, I understood what my ancestors must have felt when they faced real challenges. He stood up and began to pace, his movements agitated. We have created a perfect society, Mika. Perfect and empty. We have no real problems to solve. No genuine conflicts to resolve. We are passengers in our own lives. Mika thought about Earth, with its messy politics and ongoing struggles, its environmental challenges and social inequalities. Imperfection has its advantages, she admitted. I have been researching human history, Zephyr said. Your species has faced extinction dozens of times. Ice ages, supervolcanic eruptions, plagues, wars that could have ended your civilization. But you survived all of it. Barely, Mika said. And not without cost, but you did survive. And more than that, you grew stronger. His silver eyes fixed on hers. What does that feel like? To know that your species earned its place in the universe? The question caught Mika off guard. She had never really thought about it that way. I suppose it feels like responsibility, she said finally. When you know you've survived by being strong, you feel obligated to use that strength to protect things that matter. Zephyr nodded slowly. I would like to learn about that. About what? About being strong enough to choose weakness. About having power and using it wisely. He paused. About being the kind of person who could have hurt me but chose not to. And so began an unlikely friendship. Word of their regular conversations spread throughout the academy. Other students began to approach Mika with questions. Not about human technology or culture, but about concepts they had never needed to consider. What was courage when safety wasn't guaranteed? What was compassion when you could choose cruelty? What was strength when you had to earn it? The academy administration, initially alarmed by the incident, began to realize they had stumbled onto something unprecedented. For the first time in centuries, their students were asking questions that didn't have easy answers. Professor Meridian approached Mika after class one day. I have received a communication from the Galactic Educational Council, he said. They are requesting that you develop a curriculum on applied survival philosophy for distribution to academies throughout the galaxy. I'm not qualified for that, Mika protested. I'm just a student. Are you? Professor Meridian's star-patterned skin flickered thoughtfully. You have taught us more in one afternoon than most professors accomplish in years. Perhaps it is time to recognize that different species bring different kinds of wisdom. The request led to others. The Pacifican Collective wanted human consultants for their environmental restoration projects. Who better to advise on ecosystem management than a species that had learned to work with dangerous predators? The Vorthak Crystalline Assembly requested human input on their conflict resolution protocols. What was mediation without the possibility of genuine consequences? Most surprisingly, the Altarian Council formally invited a human delegation to discuss integration of controlled adversarial elements into advanced social structures. They had realized that their perfect society might be perfectly stagnant. As Mika worked on her final project, a comparative analysis of peaceful coexistence models across different species types, she reflected on how much had changed since that day in the classroom. Other students no longer saw her as a curiosity from a primitive world. They saw her as a representative of something they had never encountered. A species that had chosen to be civilized rather than having civilization imposed upon them. She received a message from her parents on Earth, forwarding news reports about humanity's changing status in galactic politics. The headline spoke of strategic partnerships and specialized consultation roles. Human diplomats were being invited to mediate disputes that had seemed intractable. Human scientists were being recruited for projects deemed too dangerous for other species. But perhaps the most telling change was in the Academy's motto. For 3,000 years it had read, Knowledge through Harmony. The new version, proposed by the students themselves and unanimously approved by the faculty, read, Knowledge through Understanding. Because they had learned that harmony without the possibility of conflict was just silence. But understanding, real understanding, could only come from seeing all sides of a truth, even the dangerous ones. On the day before graduation, Zephyr presented Mika with a gift, a new ceremonial blade, forged in the traditional Altarian style, but modified with human input on balance and functionality. It was beautiful and deadly in equal measure. I still do not know how to use this properly, he told her, but I understand now why it should be possible to learn. Mika accepted the blade with the respect it deserved. Maybe that's the most important lesson of all, knowing that you could learn to be dangerous but choosing to learn to be wise instead. As her shuttle prepared to depart Centauri Academy, Mika looked back at the crystal spires one last time. She was returning to Earth not as the human student who had arrived months ago, but as something new. An ambassador for the idea that strength and gentleness could coexist. That civilization was not the absence of power, but the wisdom to use it well. The galaxy would never be the same. And neither would she. In the end, the lesson had been mutual. The alien species had learned that safety was not the same as strength, and humans had learned that their greatest contribution to galactic civilization might not be their technology or their art, but their hard-won understanding of how to be dangerous and choose not to be. It was, Mika thought as Earth grew larger in the shuttle's viewport, probably the most important thing anyone could teach or learn. The universe was vast and full of wonders, but it was also full of choices, and the ones who had learned to make the right choices even when the wrong ones would be easier were the ones who deserved to inherit the stars.